Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. Usually I'm accustomed to being at the podium, but since they gave us these very plush, comfortable armchairs, which is quite rare, we're just going to settle into them and be comfortable. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Adel Iskandar. I'm the director of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome two illustrious faculty members, scholars, researchers, and public intellectuals with us today. I'll introduce them in due course, but before we commence, I wanted to say that we are convening today on the traditional, unceded, and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and many other Coast Salish nations. Here at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, along with many of our communities at the university, we foreground this detail because it is not a detail. It is actually the prevailing reality of our contemporary moment. We are, whether we choose it or not, we continue to participate in a settler colonial project, one that has completely transformed the landscape of these territories. We are convening here today in a building made of concrete, steel, and glass, very different from the actual natural ecology of this land and the manner in which its indigenous peoples would have liked it to be. And so as we think about settler colonies further afield, Palestine and elsewhere, and especially as we foreground Palestine in Canada and Canada in Palestine, it's really important to acknowledge our own personal and collective commitments to decolonize these spaces, to challenge the curricula at our universities, and to bring forth the type of scholarship as is embodied by the work of both Dr. Ayyash and Dr. Wildeman, the work that interrupts and challenges the status quo around the settler colony here in Canada. And so it is my pleasure today to be bringing to everyone's attention a work that is situated precisely at those intersections. So we are delighted to be launching Canada as a settler colony on the question of Palestine. If you haven't had a chance to get a copy of the book, it's being sold outside. Please grab yourself a copy, and it is edited by two colleagues and friends, Dr. Jeremy Wildeman and Dr. Muhannad Ayyash. Now I realize Dr. Ayyash and I have a common history in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which I won't share anything else about. Some things are best left to mystery. I'm just
both soccer stars.
Yeah, wow, I don't know, stars. Okay. I consider myself more of a gymnast. You know. So I really quickly, by way of introductions, I wanted to share the brief bios of the two editors of this book, and then we'll open things up to remarks from each of them, maybe about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll engage in a moderated conversation, and then open things up for a Q&A from the audience. So very much looking forward to that. So Dr. Jeremy Wildeman, whose PhD is from Exeter, is a fellow at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, and an adjunct professor at Carleton University, among other roles. He has lectured and published widely on Middle East politics, Canada and the Middle East, and the Middle East in global politics, all of which are not only prescient and urgent, but absolutely at the epicenter of most of the discussions that we need to have in this contemporary moment. He has extensive experience as a development and humanitarian practitioner in the region, including in Palestine. Welcome, Jeremy. And since I admitted that Dr. Muhannad and I go way back to Halifax, even though I have very little memory of that, I also must say that Dr. Jeremy Wildeman has helped me cope through our COVID days through an online group that supports estranged academics during difficult times. So thank you, Jeremy. The second editor of this book, Dr. Muhannad Ayyash, was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds, Jerusalem, before immigrating to Canada, where he is now professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence from UTP in 2019, and has recently finished writing another book, Lordship and Liberation in Palestine, Israel. He has published several academic articles on topics such as political violence, vaccine apartheid, anti-Palestinian racism, and Palestinian decolonial movements in journals such as the European Journal of International Relations, the European Journal of Social Theory, Distinction? I feel like it needs to have a more intriguing pronunciation, but Distinction and Critical Sociology. He has co-edited 2 books, the most recent being this particular volume with Dr. Wildeman. He is also the author of multiple book chapters and has written opinion pieces that some of you may have had an opportunity to read in Al Jazeera, The Baffler, Middle East Eye, Mondevice, and The Breach, among many others. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ayyash. So I'm going to pass the baton on to both of you. Tell us a little bit about the book and anything else you'd like to share with the audience, and we'll take it from there. Are you going up to the podium?
You must
Yes,
use the podium.
that might be that one. That one work?
Okay.
You know, I probably don't even need it, to be honest. but I'll speak into it anyways. So I'm going to get to just a little bit of a setup of why this book exists. And it's actually the third of a series of 3 books that I was involved in editing. Back when I was working at the University of Bath in 2017, I met a fellow named Michael Link, who at the time we were at a workshop together about Palestine. And if I remember, something like the European Union and 50 years of occupation and EU's relations, something along that lines. Because we keep adding to those years, right? How long has the West Bank and Gaza been occupied? How long have Palestinians been displaced? But Michael had the idea. Michael at the time was the UN Special Rapporteur for, I always forget the full name. Who knows the full name? It's like a sentence long, right? But basically for the occupied Palestine territory. And Michael had the idea, let's have a workshop in Canada about Canada and Palestine. There's almost no scholarship on Canada at the time, very little. Largely the scholarship would be about Canada and Israel. Or a lot of the scholarship would tend to be very orientalist in nature. So Dr. Ayyash, Professor Ayyash, and Professor Iskander, these are like real strong areas for their own work. But we wanted to fill some of that gap, plug some of that gap, especially Canada and Palestine, because there's such a rich history of connections. This is the fault line of the Middle East. Canada was one of the main countries, one of the main backers of the United Nations, a multilateral sort of international system, the multilateral order, the rules-based order, before that term was tainted in recent years. And if you're going to be connected to that, what is connected to the UN more than Israel and Palestine? Something like by the mid-1980s, the Secretary General of the UN was saying like 1/3 of UN business was about Israel and Palestine. Is it any different now? Is it even more, right? Anyway, Professor Link and I thought, let's have a small workshop together, and it ballooned into a large event with about 48 scholars, 130 people attending, over 3 days in Ottawa in 2019. And out of that, we decided to publish as many of the contributions as books as possible. So the first one that came out was What Lies Ahead, Canada's Engagement with the Middle East Peace Process and the Palestinians. And I would describe that as more of a pure foreign policy book. There's several past senior Canadian diplomats who were involved in the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, several scholars and practitioner scholars. And one of the main messages was you get some folks who kind of think Canada at times taken a fairly balanced approach, and I'm getting somewhere with this, to their relations with Israel and with Palestinians. And I'll say Palestinians because how many people in that foreign policy circle will say Palestine? My own conclusion was, well, you might have some people that are sympathetic my own contribution, my own journal article, was within that book, you might have Canadian officials who were sympathetic to both Palestinians and Israelis, or just Israelis, but never that sort of balanced, that real interest in the plight of the Palestinians. The second book was advocating for Palestine in Canada, a very interesting book. I should have mentioned, I quoted the first one with Dr. Emma Swan, the other one with Professor Emily Wills, Michael Beckert, who's the Vice President of CJPME now, and Professor Nadia Abu-Zahra. It's a really interesting book, more of an ethnography about the experiences of people as activists in Canada, particularly Jewish Canadians, Arab Canadians, and then Canadians who don't have either background, and their experiences over the decades advocating for Palestine in Canada, which is really easy, right? Not in any way whatsoever. So some very interesting chapters. Always stands out for me in all of these books is just the opening chapter in this book does that. How Arabs and Palestinians are forced to be quiet while atrocities are being committed. And somebody may not even understand that they're Arab and start talking in quite vulgar terms, referring to Palestinians, referring to Arabs, referring to Muslims. And you can see this in chapters throughout that book, and the way the state and institutions like universities, there's a great book by, a great chapter by Sam Hussein who talks about how the struggles of campus students in Carleton University and University of Ottawa from the 1970s up until basically the inhabitants. That's missing because that happened since the book was published. And finally we get to, imagine this is going to be a 1-week workshop and it turned into a 4-year project about Canada's relationship with the Palestinians. Our book tonight, Canada as a separate colony on the questioning of Palestine. And this is a little bit more in line with my own conclusions back to my thesis research, where the guiding paradigm on Canada's relationship with the Palestinians is their shared separate colonialism. I talk about this in my own chapter. Having grown up in Saskatchewan in one of the more rural areas, the Battlefords region. If you guys heard about it, it's where the Riel Rebellion was put down, so it's quite important for the last vestiges of the Riel Rebellion and sort of the Indigenous and Métis uprising. So it's one of there's a lot of connections I saw, including the violence against Indigenous people with, I spent about 8 years in the West Bank, the violence I saw firsthand in the West Bank. And that violence looks like nothing like we're seeing right now. So this is sort of an arc, a 4-year project. We almost ended up with a 4th book, by the way. Maybe thankfully not. But it had a very good title, Canada and the Unmaking of Palestine. And we had several scholars. Unfortunately, your chapter is not in it anymore. It's moving off somewhere else, right? But describing Canada's role at a diplomatic level, almost like a counter to the first collection. Canada's role working in international institutions undermining the Palestinian right to self-determination. So I want to maybe just move over to Muhannad now to sort of talk about that separate coloniality. Right? Let's look at it. Describe in the book what's happening right now and what the connections are between Canada, Israel, Palestine. Ronnie.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And that was quite a workshop that Jeremy and others organized, and I know that there were many people involved in organizing it, but Jeremy did a heck of a lot of work to organize that and did a lot of fundraising and brought us all together. For a lot of us, we had not met each other before. It was a obviously very fruitful 2 or 3 days, I can't remember now, but of discussions and presentations that led to so much scholarship being produced, which is fantastic. For us, it culminated in this edited collection, where it makes a scholarly contribution by really putting together, as far as we know, for the first time in Canada anyway, the question of Canadian settler colonialism at the forefront of the analysis of the relationship between Canada and Palestine. And highlighting how Canadian settler colonialism informs Canadian support for settler colonialism abroad, among other things. What I wanted to kind of just spend a few minutes on here today, and I'm sure we'll discuss this through the discussion and the Q&A, is what does it mean when you talk about settler colonialism in Palestine? What does it mean to talk about Israeli settler colonialism and how that relates to Canadian settler colonialism? One of the common talking points that you get, which I have no patience for when it comes from scholars, I have more patience for it when it comes from people who genuinely don't know much about the topic and would like to learn more. There's nothing wrong with not knowing much about how settler colonialism works and its history and all of those things, and wanting to ask questions. What is it? What makes Israel a settler colony? How does that? No problems with any of that. And I'll spend as much of my time as I can with people who are genuinely curious about that. What I don't have patience for is disingenuous scholars who are a dime a dozen in Canadian universities, who should know better, yet still try to conceal and obfuscate Israeli settler colonialism with what are ultimately weak talking points that show their misunderstanding of what settler colonialism is. And the most common talking point is, well, Israeli settler colonialism doesn't exactly look Canadian, like Canadian settler colonialism, therefore it cannot be settler colonialism. This shows a very shallow understanding of not just settler colonialism, but power structures and how they work. There's no such thing as a power structure that looks the same everywhere. It doesn't exist for anything. Patriarchy, capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever, any form of power that you want to take, it will never look the same exactly the same in different contexts. So Israeli settler colonialism is ultimately a project of eliminating Palestinian sovereignty and Palestinian existence on the land. That's all. That's the sort of most one of the more sort of broad defining features of settler colonialism everywhere in all contexts is that it cannot tolerate even the idea of indigenous sovereignty. So it must expel indigenous people from the land and replace them with settlers, where the indigenous people become the minority. That's first and foremost what it does. But for those minority that then remain on the land, and Israel is not done, of course, as we see the ongoing genocide as an effort to finish the job. When they talk about finish the job, it's not about finish Hamas, it's finish the settler colonial conquest of Palestine, where only about 20% of the total population from the river to the sea will be Palestinian. Maybe less than that for some Israeli political groups. But regardless of the physical elimination of people, which is of course the critical point, what is common across all settler colonies, regardless of what stage of the settler colonial conquest they are in, they all agree 100% that there can never be such a thing as an indigenous sovereignty. That is non-negotiable for settler colonies. Take Canada, for example. All this truth and reconciliation talk, all of this, we're going to make things right, all of this, we want to hear from indigenous voices, whether it's in media or universities or land acknowledgements or politicians and all that nonsense. Bring up indigenous sovereignty and see how they all go running. They all walk away from that. Not even the NDP. Nobody wants anything to do with indigenous sovereignty. Because that is what makes a settler colony a settler colony. It claims exclusive sovereignty over the territory. No other sovereign power can exist there, even if it is under the thumb of the colonial power. It can't be sovereign. It's just not on the books. So, same with Israel. There's no such thing as Palestinian sovereignty. They will never allow that. They've said that out loud. They've said it through their actions. It's not something that they will ever accept. Because that's what settler colonies do. They cannot accept the existence of indigenous sovereignty. They want indigenous people to only remain as minority groups within the settler colonial state, within the structure of the ultimate, indivisible, absolute sovereignty of the settler colonial power. This is basically where we are today still. Over this past year, we've seen the Israeli state take this take up the armed attack on October 7th as the pretext for its expansion of settler colonial conquest of Palestine, in the genocide in Gaza, where they are trying actively to kill as many Palestinians as possible, expel as many Palestinians as possible, and colonize as much of the Gaza Strip as they can. They are doing land grabs in the West Bank, making life so miserable for Palestinians that if they don't, that if they don't leave, basically that Palestinians start to make the calculation, if I don't leave, I have no future here. And that's the end goal. The end goal is official exclusive Israeli sovereignty over the entirety of the land from the river to the sea. When you start to understand that the settler colonial paradigm is the only paradigm that you can use to make sense of what's happening in Palestine, is to use the only one that you can use to make sense of Israeli actions, you start to have a different view of everything else around the question of Palestine and the question of Israel, including Israel's relations with the West, which includes Canada. And ultimately, the interests for the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of historic Palestine emerges out of the British Empire, not because they were trying to resolve the Jewish question in Europe and anti-Semitism and any of those things. They did it for two reasons. They didn't want Eastern European Jews moving into the UK. And they wanted an imperial outpost for them in the region. They wanted a state that would be entirely dependent on its existence on the empire, which means that you're going to gain their loyalty. In those two fundamental ways, nothing has changed. The US still views this in the same way. Now, of course, they don't have as much of the fear of European Jews moving into the US, but the imperial aspect of Israel acting as an imperial outpost for the US is still the predominant reason why the US and Canada and the UK and Germany and France continue to give unconditional support for Israel. And so you start, when you put everything within this paradigm of settler colonialism and colonial modernity more broadly, you start to better understand why Canada takes the position that it does. It has nothing to do with all the bullshit about democracy and the only democracy in the Middle East and, oh, this is the only safeguard for Jewish populations across the world and any of those things. It has nothing to do with any of those things. It has nothing to do with the ideals that Canada proclaims to stand for, like human rights and dignity and international rule of law and all of those. It has nothing to do with any of that. Because if it did, you'd have consistency on these fronts, but there's clearly zero consistency from Canada. It only does things in accordance with its interests. So when you move away from that paradigm and you move into the settler colonial paradigm, then you start to see that there are these affinities between settler colonies. Not just strategic material affinities, but also ideological ones that enable the continuation of the eradication of indigenous sovereignties, whether here or there, and all under the guise of some greater civilizing project, of some greater ideal or cause that is for the betterment of humanity and all the rest of it. You see similar tactics that are used, whether it comes to policing, to the use of military equipment against civilians, and so on. Techniques of surveillance, all of these things. You'll see all kinds of relationships and all kinds of similarities start to pop up between different settler colonies and how they operate in breaking the will of the indigenous resistance and eliminating indigenous calls for sovereignty. And so it starts to give you a different world view of the whole picture, which then enables you to see the obstacles in front of us in a different light. And therefore, what solutions are needed, you start to see them in a different light, and so on. So it's to me, the settler colonial paradigm is necessary because it is the one that gets us closest to the reality on the ground. And you cannot resolve issues unless you have an honest understanding of them. So this is not to me just an academic debate. This is a question about how do we make sense of reality and what paradigm we use to try to, that will allow us to get closer to reality so that we can at the very least, name things for what they are, understand the obstacles better, and therefore come up with actually sensible solutions to those problems. So this is for me what is at stake between these debates. And the more people cling to the old liberal worldview of Canada's a democracy and a multicultural blah, 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 and all of that nonsense, the more you are concealing reality. It's not just you're wrong. You are concealing reality, a reality that is enabling what is happening today in Gaza. A reality that is genocidal. So this is not some light debate. And I'm not, this is why I am harsh against so-called scholars that engage in these continuous silly talking points about settler colonialism and their misunderstanding of the paradigm and so on. I genuinely, I think that this is not just some misplaced academic, way of thinking. They should know better at this point. I'm not going to give them a grace at this point for scholars of what, especially in political science, but other disciplines as well, including sociology, that continuously conceal this reality, which means that they continuously propagate the reality, the brutal reality that we see on the ground. So I'll end it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I just quickly want to say that actually, you mentioned there's great inconsistencies if you use the liberal paradigm, right? Is this working? Yeah, okay, amazing. About international law and human rights, and we're seeing like the West, we saw the big juxtaposition, right, with Ukraine, where, oh my gosh, this country is being invaded, there's a genocide taking place against the Ukrainians, and then suddenly with the Palestinians.
And settler colonialism, by the way, they used that.
Yeah,
Genocide and settler colonialism against Ukraine was used in 2 seconds. Yeah.
Timothy Schneider, in particular, has used that paradigm back to his book Bloodlines, talking about the Soviet Union and Germany, and quickly applied it, right? And suddenly silence, right? Silence when it comes to Palestine. And think about Canada in particular on this issue has been so vociferous on Ukraine. I have Ukrainian heritage. I talk about that in my chapter in the book. Yet when it comes to the Palestinians, there is great consistency. You can see it. Our book came out in October as the horrible events started to take place that we're seeing, and everything this book predicted was that Canada would do what it could to protect Israel, to do whatever it wanted to do in Palestine, and it's correct. And even if you look through the series of books advocating for Palestine in Canada, the repression of civil society as they tried to stand up for human rights, and even the foreign policy book. Well, we're interested in peace between two sides, and there's two people fighting each other, or Israel is unique. It's an outpost of civilization and democracy in the region, and you can see that permeating that book as well. But that imbalance, right? And so all 3 books actually really predict how Canada would react through the scholarship. Some of the leading scholars and past policymakers in Canada put together. This is what Canada is, and it helps us shed light on what Canada is, and maybe what Canada could do differently. Can it do something differently on Turtle Island is the question, right? That's an open question, like with Israel. But it allows us to understand what is taking place. And for that reason also, it's not very popular in political science.
Yeah.
Because political science is there to reinforce power.
So, you've raised a lot of very, very important and very provocative points, and I wanted to kind of open things up a little bit and maybe kind of zoom in on a few of those key observations and maybe allow us to understand them better. One of the arguments that I hear quite often is built around the assumption that Canada is a small international player, that Canadian politics are driven by the United States, and that essentially whether the positions that we hold as a state vis-a-vis Palestine and Palestinian sovereignty and discussions around statehood and everything else are driven by Washington, D.C. What's your take on that particular view of things, which basically assumes that we are kind of hanging on to the coattails of the Americans and not really deciding things for ourselves?
You go first.
Yeah, we definitely work with it, yeah. So you hear this a lot, especially from liberal politicians and NDPers, who will tell you, oh, we agree with you, but what can we do? It's the Americans. Well, one thing you can do is say that out loud. How about that? Just go on TV and say, I wish we Canada would take a better position on Palestine, but the Americans don't want us to and we can't go against them. I would love to see a politician say that out loud. At least you'd be doing something honorable, honestly. But it's also a lie. So that there's lots, so there's the answer of what I think will happen versus what could happen. So I'll give the what could happen. What will happen is nothing. Canada will be when there is finally economic isolation and political isolation for Israel against Israel, Canada will be the second last country to join in, the US being the last. But what could happen is that Canada could get together with, they keep telling us we're a middle power, go get together with other middle powers. You can, forget me, forget the speech that I'm going to give and all of that, forget my positions on decolonization and justice and all of the rest of it. You can get together with Norway, Ireland, Spain, Turkey, and many in the global south, and you can go to the US and say, we're your friends and we're doing an intervention. This is not good for you, what you're doing. In the long term, this is not healthy. You need to lay back. And we're gonna now introduce something in the UN that's gonna put pressure on Israel, and you're gonna have to live with that. And take your medicine, and you'll get better. I swear, rehab will help, and everything will be great afterwards. They can do that kind of bullshit, which would be better than what they're doing right now. But that's a completely possible path of action that Canada could take. Sure, you can't do it by yourself, but who says that you only work by yourself? You keep telling us it's all about multilateralism. Go do it. Go do the work of multilateralism or shut up about it. That's what I'll say.
So I have a piece in the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal that came out last year that basically I take your position, Muhannad, against two of the great luminaries, the powerful luminaries in political science, Kim Richard Nossel and Adam Chapnick, who are arguing in their case that we got to stick with the United States, although Nossel will maybe not feel that way now that Trump is the president. But I make much the same argument as you, that Canada has to orient itself to more of a multilateral approach in the world and to recognize the global south, including how Canada's changed, right? How many Canadians feel sympathetic with the Western narrative generally of the Middle East and Canada's interactions with the global south? This fake multiculturalism you talk about, and Azeezah has a really good chapter about that in our book. But I want to get to like Canada. When Canada was most powerful and influential in international affairs, when do you think that was? I'm going to ask you folks. When do you think Canada was the most influential in foreign affairs? When was it? Because Canada, a lot of people used, when Trudeau came to power, he said Canada's back, right? A lot of Canadians were excited. The international community was exuberant when he said that. But what is that referring to?
Crisis.
Sorry?
Suez
crisis is very important, right? Canada helps the Brits, basically the British and French, to evacuate from Egypt and save face by establishing modern peacekeeping as we know. But that's a good question. And by the way, if you study in the UK, we never talk about the Suez crisis here. That's one of the most important things in the UK because that's the end of their empire. The United States says, no, you're done. You're done. They did a fake regime change where I won't get into it.
During the time of Jacques Chrétien, when he was the prime minister, our foreign policy was little bit distinguished and different. And Canada at that time took position in certain topic was completely different, and to a degree it was fair.
And I'll agree with you. So Canada did sort of screwed up in 1979. Does anybody know how Canada screwed up in 1979? Canada's screwed up a lot, right? We've talked about the settler colonialism and we know what Canada's state, but Canada did something really sort of boneheaded in 1979, or one of its political parties did.
Is it the American office?
Canada got a lot of praise for that, but Iran-Canada relations definitely suffered. But Canada-United States relations really blossomed because Canada helped American diplomats escape Iran. Did anybody know what happened in 1979? It's actually really important. And it's really important in the context of what we're seeing right now. Yeah.
What would be the population ratio between Israelite and the Palestinian?
Oh, I'll maybe get.
This question may be just out of nothing, but
I'll get back to that. It's
population.
It's about 50-50 almost.
Which I was wondering.
Yeah, it's about 50-50 right now.
But there's a lot of Palestinian refugees outside, which
Yeah.
it's actually about 2 to 1 when you count Palestinian diaspora, 2 to 1 for Palestinians. But 1979, the Progressive Conservative Party at the time, was a different Conservative Party, promised in its campaign, one of its campaign pitches was to move Canada's embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And right away when Joe Clark comes to power as the youngest prime minister in Canadian history, and lasts 9 months, he entered a diplomatic crisis because it was so deeply unpopular in the world. One of the lessons learned, I go into a long history about why this is so important for Canada. One of the lessons learned was that when he sent out his predecessor, the Right Honourable Robert L. Stanfield, to the Middle East to find, hey, how can we improve Canada's relations in the Middle East? His immediate findings were, don't move the embassy. So remember how controversial this was with Donald Trump? Canada was the trailblazer. It's not surprising when you look at Canada's history and its connections to Israel, to South Africa, but Canada didn't do this, and Robert L. Stanfield came back and said, look, one of his tasks was how do we improve Canadian relations in the region, and how do we improve relations for Israel's security? And the immediate response was Canada should act like a fair-minded actor in the Middle East. And effectively, Canada did that in the 1990s, and that made Canada very distinct. And by the way, the Americans loved that about Canada. So they could rely on Canada in the Middle East peace process to do things that they could not do, convene meetings they could not do. And one of the things I did take away from the research on the first edited volume was the extent to which Canadian diplomats did, now we can question whether Oslo was a good idea or not, but really put in an effort to keep Oslo going, including back-channel talks when Netanyahu first comes to power and starts undermining the Oslo process. Canada kept convening meetings in the background. John Kerry, the Obama peace plan in 2016, was using the work of Canadian diplomats and scholars on finding a sovereignty-sharing solution for Jerusalem. So Canada, when it was at its greatest power, it was fighting to lead the refugee working group, the most sensitive and important part of the Oslo peace process, for its own diplomatic image, and Canada definitely in the 1990s, for various reasons, was probably at the height of its diplomatic power. So quite contrary to these clowns, I would describe them as now, who say, well, we just need to do it with the United States, the bad scholarship we kind of have now, right, that has grown up, who say we need to just do what the United States wants us to do. That's actually not in the Americans' interest either. Now Canada is almost a nobody in international affairs, and it's part of the decline.
Can I just ask another question in light of here in Canada, Canadians very often have this assumption or presumed, thinking that that Canadian settler colonialism is a very benign, soft, and gentle one, right? I mean, a lot of that has been challenged by, the discovery of mass graves at residential schools, and it's opened up a very important, very critical, very urgent conversation about the violent history of the settler colonial project here. But nevertheless, there is this kind of veneer of softness, the sort of it's almost like a non-violent settler colonial project in comparison to, let's say, other settler colonial projects elsewhere. And so we often see and feel that Canada is sort of a peace-loving player in the world of international law. And so when we map that onto moments of egregious and really rapturous moments of incredible violence, say, the Rwandan genocide, or, what's happening in Ukraine, Canada is always sort of quick to, of course there is often missteps and mishaps, but is very quick to play the role of the corrective in those types of situations. I mean, a lot of it disingenuous, but sometimes playing that kind of corrective role. We've got examples from the Rwandan genocide where Canada can kind of wash its hands off by saying, look at General Dallaire and all that sort of, we were never really on that side to begin with. What about the situation with the genocide in Gaza? I mean, this is something. It is a largely incontestable, situation where Canada finds itself essentially as a state naked in front of international law, right? Now, if the Americans are prepared to do so, right, and are prepared to take that sort of risk and isolation, Canada, being the presumed kind of international player that it appears to or tries to presume itself to be, is now much more precarious in the world of international law than ever before. So the question is, how is Canada capable of justifying its current position, given its sort of history of being, a soft nation, right? Vis-a-vis an absolutely egregious mass crime that has lasted for more, of course, dating 76 years, but with the most unbelievably colossal, iteration of that over the past, 13 months or so.
So there's no such thing as a soft settler colonialism or a non-violent settler colonialism. There's people that lived on land and then they're no longer living there. They didn't leave, just go, oh, hi, yeah, come take it all. I'll go in that reserve and just sit there. And thank you for letting me stay on the reserve. I appreciate it. You're such kind people. Nobody says that. There's no such thing. It was violent here. There was physical genocide and cultural genocide. And don't fall into this trap of thinking one is softer than the other. There's no such thing as cultural genocide is a residential school. It's taking kids out of their homes, physically abusing them, sexually abusing them, psychologically abusing them, destroying indigenous families for generations to come. It's a brutal system of violence that is ongoing. And it's not just residential schools. It's a 60s school, but like I said, it's a destruction of intentional destruction of what makes the environments in which these communities thrive. Killing the bison, spreading disease, weaponization of disease, scalping, which happened across first certainly in Halifax. In the history of Halifax, there was scalping that happened there, and so on and so forth. Right. So it's a brutal story of settler colonization here. And that's what Indigenous communities have been telling us for a long time. So, I've been talking to Indigenous and Palestinian activists this last year. I can tell you, when you ask Palestinian youth, is Canada a settler colony or is it a multicultural liberal democracy? They laugh at the question now. There's no hesitation. It's a settler colony. And I go, did you always think that? No. But now it's as clear as daylight. So this last year has changed a lot of people, and even and I'm speaking mostly to younger generation. But I asked them, I was like, "Oh, what about your parents, your uncles?" And they're like, "They're off Canada now too. Like nobody's thinking of Canada as this great. Like so, the mask is off. It's been off forever for Indigenous communities. They've been telling us forever about what Canada really is for a long time. And if you had listened to them, you wouldn't have been surprised by Canada's position. That's why we're not surprised when we saw Canada's position this last year and its continuing position today. It's because we looked at it from the settler colonial lens. And you do see how liberal ideology is used to conceal what are some of the most brutal forms of violence, which is settler colonial forms of violence. And I'll let Jeremy handle this a little bit more, but on the international level, Canada's reputation has been taking a hit for quite some time, people. This isn't new. People started to ignore them a while back. People started to see right through Canada's role that it played for the US when the US was smarter in the 90s. Jeremy put it in a nice scholarly way. I'll put it in a bit of a crass way. Canada's was, the US's little poodle cute dog. They do nasty things and they know they're nasty things, the US, and they're like, but look, if this little dog likes us, we can't be that bad. And that's Canada's role in the 90s. It was just putting a nice face on the Americans and telling people, look, my friend, he can get a bit angry sometimes, but he's a nice guy. You gotta just let's work together and see what we can do. And they would do some of that behind the scene work, whether it's in Ireland or in Palestine. And I'm sure those Canadian officials and negotiators, I know one of them did have good intentions of like, well, I can come up with a security structure in Jerusalem where it would work for both. Like we can actually make this work, and he had a nice plan that included international security forces and where the old city especially would be governed by this shared sovereignty, shared security, and it was this wonderful plan, and of course the Israelis said no to it, because they had no actual interest in any of this stuff. So I'm sure some of those individuals went in with good intentions, but the process in which all of these negotiations happened in the 1990s were only designed to break the Palestinian uprising of 1987 to 1993, the first Intifada. That's Oslo was a response to the uprising. It was trying to prevent the reappearance of an uprising like that would be a people's uprising, that would really challenge Israeli settler colonialism. And they had the brilliant move of creating the Palestinian Authority that would then do the dirty work for them and prevent the reappearance of mass mobilization like we saw in 87. And it has worked, by the way, because the next uprising didn't look like nothing like the first one. It was already working then, and now there's no uprising. It is not by accident. So sure, Canada can play those roles, and good, well-meaning people and all the rest of it, in Rwanda, in South Africa, and other places. But today, the majority of the world, it's not just Canada that they're not buying into. They're not buying into the international liberal order. Most of them never have, by the way. But now it's becoming very obvious that countries across the world are not playing this game anymore. Canada is not helping itself with all of its votes in the United Nations on the question of Palestine, and most countries around the world go, who are you? What are you saying here? Yeah, okay. What can you do to me? Some of those countries are stronger economically than Canada. And they're not buying this international liberal order because it was never real. And now Trump is going to come in and destroy it all, and I think most of the world was celebrating that, his election, because they know that that's what he's going to do. But anyway, that's for another discussion. But yeah.
Yeah, you and I would have been surprised, but pleasantly, if the settler colonial paradigm wouldn't have governed how Canada reacted to October 7th.
Yeah.
And one of the, and you make me even think further. One of sort of the things you never really hear about much in international relations or world history, if you're doing it through a political science lens, is colonialism. The word colonialism and Western colonialism is dead. If you ever meet like EU officials, they're always saying we need to forget about the past. We need to forget about the past. Try that seriously with any global South country. Try that with Indian scholars, with Chinese scholars. Their whole modern identity, the whole modern identity of China is to get strong enough so that the great humiliation doesn't happen again, and so they don't get colonized again. And we're seeing firsthand, the West is kind of reminding the global South too right now with Palestine. Look, we can still do what we did. This is what Palestine is an example of. That's why the Iranians are so concerned, because they know that, oh, this is happening in Palestine, this is happening in Lebanon. This was the threat, right? And even we saw like the Biden administration sort of trying to restrain the Israelis to an extent that civilians in Iran just don't get randomly killed. Hospitals blown up. Like this is the new paradigm of this warfare, right? But that's how you get rid of a population, right? The settler colonial paradigm. In foreign affairs now, Canada is a nobody country. It's weak. Canada only was popular and had some strength when it looked like it was a country based on justice. This was always a false paradigm. So this Ponzi scheme or whatever term I should use, it has failed now. You can see what Canada really is in foreign affairs. And it goes back to a joke. This is catching my train of thought there. I was stumbling along. when Canada entered the international community around the Suez Crisis, like, it's really important, the Suez Crisis, to Canada's identity, because that's where the idea of Canada, the benign, peacemonger, in the Middle East, peacekeepers, even though Canada was really doing that to help out the Americans and the Brits, because Canada was really worried. At the time of the Suez Crisis in 1956, they were worried, oh my gosh, the Americans are angry at the Brits. They're threatening to basically destroy the British economy for invading Egypt without their permission. The Soviet Union was even raising the specter of nuclear war. The United States was livid with the British, and they just didn't want another empire to exist. Ultimately, you can see it with the American hegemony right now, that they don't want another competitor in the world, right? So even if they like the Brits and they like the French, this wasn't going to happen. Canada understood what was happening in the 1950s, and they realized we need to be that fixer for these two empires. And Canada went to the world in the 1950s and said, hey, look, you know, I know the Americans, the French, Belgians, Dutch, they terrorized you. They were horrible towards you. But Canada wouldn't say that because they didn't think it that way. Okay, we know they colonized. I think Canada had much more benign impressions of what colonialism looked like, especially colonial officials at that time. But Canada would said to the global south, we're like you. We never colonized anyone. We were a colony. And they went into the international community like this, and then they started to build up this impression, this image of the global south. They started to have multiculturalism. Suddenly people had family members in Canada. Canada always looked more progressive and better to the international community. And this has collapsed, and also Canada's influence in the world has collapsed. It's amazing. Look at Trudeau's government. We're in a diplomatic spat with basically every global south country right now, even ones that don't like each other. Like Canada's managed to upset them all. China, India, Saudi Arabia. Like these three don't really, but they're in BRICS, but Russia, obviously, it's not the second world, right? But yeah, Canada is now, this Canada, the settler colonial one, is very weak in foreign affairs. And can it maintain itself internally? What if Quebec decides it wants a nation? Right? This Canada, this darker Canada, don't know if it works.
So you've removed the shroud completely, which has made asking questions a little bit more complicated because you've really cut to the chase and dismantled the whole kind of like structural system on which all of this is built. But I'm gonna invite you to kind of zoom in and help us understand specific entanglements, Canadian entanglements with issues pertaining to Palestine. The first is Palestinian statehood. It's a conversation that's currently happening, increasingly more robust because of specific actors, specific political figures trying to bring the conversation to the forefront, and others very vociferously suppressing it. What does this mean? Is it anything to be taken seriously, or is this just a fig leaf?
No, fig leaf. So just wanted to go to one point you said. So yes, we don't spend much time here, and there's no need, honestly, on tearing down the ideological curtain. And let's get to the real discussion, and that's better. But I just want to say that ideological curtain still exists, is out there, and is very strong. So just because you can easily do it intellectually, it doesn't mean you can do it practically. And it still works on a whole lot of people, including some Palestinians and Arabs and people from all over. They still believe in it and subscribe to it. So it's one thing to do it intellectually, it's a whole other to do it practically. So it remains an important conversation, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Now, when it comes to Palestinian statehood, again, I'm just gonna cut through the BS because I don't have time. Life is too short. Whenever you have conversations with politicians, they don't talk to me anymore. But there was a few times before when they didn't really know me very well, and they may have been in meetings with me, and that's mistakes. Not anymore. But at any rate, you can tell when you push them by saying what I just said, which is like, I don't have time. Like, let's get to the real thing. They're like, we know what's going on. So there's their public statements, and then there's really the conversations that happen. And you'd have to be an idiot. Sorry, but you'd have to be an idiot if you're in the know. I'm not talking about people who are barely surviving on their minimum wage job and I don't have time to get it. Those are not included in what I'm saying. For those people, I make all the time in the world, and I am much more gracious, and I have much more patience and all the rest of it. But For politicians and scholars, I have no zero. They don't deserve any. They know exactly what's going on. They know that Israel has no interest whatsoever in a Palestinian state. And I mean, you'd have to be a real moron to say that out loud now and think that you're telling the truth. Because the Israelis themselves now say it out loud. In this last year, Knesset passed a resolution saying, never going to be a Palestinian state. We oppose it. It's an existential threat to Israel. So Knesset now says that. Netanyahu has been saying it for decades. And then, again, you didn't need to wait for their words. All their actions indicate that they had never been interested in it. Again, that's what makes a settler colony a settler colony. It's a refusal of indigenous sovereignty and the elimination of it, so that means no interest in the state. So even go to the 1990s, in the middle of the peace process and all of that, settlement expansion started to shoot up. If you're serious about we're just getting off the, we want to get off on the right foot with these people and we want to negotiate a two-state solution, is that what you would do? Expand settlements and make it impossible for that thing to be achieved? Of course not. That's it. The conversation is over there. Like I said, some of these people, this guy, famous military guy in Canada, and when we talked about Jerusalem, and I said, well, okay, for starters, Israel wants to take all of Jerusalem, and he's just like, yeah, of course, moving on. Right? This is what I mean. They already know this shit. Because it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure it out. If you're part of the propaganda machine, you're not buying into the propaganda. And then, if you have time to study this stuff, then you're not going to buy into the propaganda. So either way, you know the truth. Israel doesn't want a state. Everybody knows this around the world. So why do they keep saying it? They keep saying it because that's what keeps the nice looking face out. Oh, look, we have a just solution. 2 states. And they're all going to live happily ever after, and that's what we. But they all know that Israel doesn't want it, and they all know that nothing is being done to make Israel want it. So what does that make you when that's the line that you put out publicly, and you know that it's not going to lead to anything? It makes you complicit in the denial of that thing, and it makes you a liar, and it makes you. Someone who shouldn't be taken, should be attacked in this way. That's why I have no patience for it. The global South is still pushing for a 2-state solution. Now, their understanding of a 2-state solution is very different than even Canada's. So Canada's version of a 2-state solution now is basically in line with the liberal Zionist version, which is self-administration over discontiguous territories. Well, it'll all amount to about 8% maybe of the total of historic Palestine. So just Area A of the West Bank. Not sovereignty, not statehood, self-administration. You get to decide your marriage laws, your health laws, whatever. Not your education, not your curriculum. That's got to be policed. But other things like that. Culture and all that stuff. You can get to keep that. You can even have it for that. We might even call it a state, but it's not a real state. You have no military, no say on your borders, no right of return. Jerusalem is gone, and no access over resources. You can't collect your taxes. You can't have your own currency or come up with your own foreign currency. That's right now what it's
trade with.
You can. They'll probably allow some of that, but it would have to be, of course, negotiated with the Israelis because you have no currency and no foreign policy. So ultimately, you're already limited within that anyway. So sure, you can have that, and most likely the Israelis would okay it behind the scenes with the other side of the bilateral agreement. That's what when a Canadian politician today says a 2-state solution, they understand that this is probably what it would look like if it gets that at all. The global South, obviously, when you look at, for example, the ICJ hearings, everybody's understanding of a 2-state solution is 1967 borders, dismantlement of settlements, full Palestinian sovereignty, full self-determination. That means a military, that means foreign policy, that means it has to be contiguous with Gaza and the West Bank. It's right of return, some will talk about that, some won't. But that version of it is gone. So, where we're left at today is statehood being thrown around as a way to conceal reality and enable the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. Yeah.
And it's still more than Canada's offering First Nations.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're willing to
Yeah.
offer, right?
Yeah.
That level of self-determination. So you can see
Self-administration, not determination.
That's right.
Not self-determination, not for the Palestinians. So Canada is willing to offer a little bit of self-administration to Indigenous communities here, but not self-determination or sovereignty.
They could never invite somebody to visit them.
As a sovereign.
Palestinians. So you can see the parallels here. You're right, not self-determination.
Yeah.
That's something. And by the way, also something you might not realize is the second biggest sort of trade market for Israelis, although it's internal effectively, because it's really one state right now. Because it's control, like from a political science Hegelian perspective, it's one state controlled by the Israeli military, including Gaza. All this fake argument, but Israel's not really in Gaza. They're controlling every aspect of Gaza, especially now, destroying every aspect of Gaza. But the Israelis make an incredible amount of money off the Palestinians. Something like 80% of the foreign aid to Palestinians ends up going to Israel. All the foreign trade that is redirected through like Israeli ports. The second biggest and captive trade market for Israelis is the Palestinian economy. So there's great benefits to like that form. Imagine if the British still paid for Indigenous Services Canada. So this is Canada, how Canada might actually abuse that money coming into Canada. Right? So effectively, the international community is also paying for the Palestinians to pay the Israelis, and Palestinian labor is being abused to build Israeli settlements and to build Israeli communities and to allow the Israelis to focus on high tech and military. There's a lot of benefits to them within this structure, right? But when it comes to the state, there's arguments around it, right? My thesis supervisor, Yolan Papa, is one of the people arguing for one state where everybody's equal, and it's probably not, doesn't even know what the name would be, but it's not going to be a Zionist state, right? But it's a state that would be very open and welcoming to Jewish people, and you can see across the Middle East to this moment, despite the violence, that, and maybe more than ever actually, we see Muslims and Arabs welcoming Jewish people to live among them, right? And the Arabs have been really trying at a governmental level since 2002 with the Saudis. I forget the name of the peace plan, Saudi peace plan 2002. They're still like, hey, just make peace. We want you to live in the region and do trade with us. And you have an extremist element of Israel that doesn't want this. But also in the West, we don't really want it. It's our vision of Israel. It goes back to the Crusades. Again, they kind of touched on this in our book. Like it's very similar sort of we want to divide and conquer, have this outpost in the region, but also there's a lot of right now, the biggest supporters for Israel are less the Jewish community that's really breaking with Israel, but Christian Zionists, right? Especially in the United States. It's a little bit different in Canada, though the Conservative Party has a lot of those elements. There are a lot of folks that will argue that Canada, that our friend Artie will argue that, Artie sees that Canada should recognize Palestine as a state, and people should recognize Palestine as a state because of the legal protections that will come up. I think you and I, Muhannad, are a little bit in the vein where we look at power politics and we kind of sometimes think that international law is fake and this is the proof and that Trump is proving it. See, it's all fake, but there is international law. People still believe in it. It's still important. So you can make a strong argument for there needing to be a Palestinian state so that Palestine can have greater protections with the ICC, in particular with the ICJ. So there's different perspectives on that, right? And you could argue about that, but we know what the peace plan for the West is, right? It's what we just described, right? Domination, control, and Israel gets off pretty well with that financially.
Actually, Jeremy, now that you mentioned international law, can we like move not laterally, but just kind of diagonally towards that more specifically? So where does Canada stand in relation to international law on Palestine, and to what extent is it consistent with the failures of international law versus acting in contravention to international law? Because we're starting to see, as Artie might be explaining, that international law is finally beginning to have, is no longer able to ignore the Palestine case or can do so indefinitely, or else the international legal order will effectively collapse. But at the same time, there are no legal teeth, which how do you enact this law? And then so Canada finds itself in a situation where it either it subscribes to, it is a signatory to it, and believes in, or acts or at least performs international law, or it fails to acknowledge its very existence. So where does Canada fit in this kind of changing international legal realm?
Yeah. So okay. So let me start it with this point that I've learned from Arti is international law is not a static thing, and I agree with that. Right? It's a dynamic arena. Palestinians, I make that very clear that Palestinians should be involved in that arena, should pursue that path. The key point for me is don't centralize it. Don't wait for international law to validate our framings and our understanding and our narration of our story. And always keep justice as the guiding principle of our struggle, not international law. International law is a tool, not a guideline, not a guiding framework. Because it is an arena of confrontation. International law is not some neutral arena. The system of international law is something that was foundationally designed to promote and enable imperialism and colonialism across the world. It's only, and I learned this from Artie's own work, it's only with the third world approaches to international law and the decolonization movements of the 1960s and 70s that you start to see some of the good things that we now find in international law. So most of the, for example, aspects of international law that speak against colonization, the right to resistance against colonization, that doesn't come from the West. It comes from the global South, who intervened in the arena of international law to introduce these aspects, basically trying to use international law to oppose colonialism, as opposed to what it was designed for, which was to enable it. So this is an ongoing battle within that arena. But now the critical point that everybody, including the legal scholars who still believe in international law, like Arti and others, they understand that it has no key. That all it is just an idea, a terrain for an ideological battle that has to be then taken up by people on the ground to use to advance the struggle itself, and by states in the global South as well. So when the ICJ, for example, ruled that there's a plausible genocide, of course, with all the weaknesses and flaws of that ruling, but the message that I received from legal scholars who worked very hard on that case was, take this now up on the streets, because that's the only place that can take it anywhere. Nothing's going to happen in this institution. There's no accountability measure attached to this. And this is where that arena is pure power politics. Because there's no accountability way. So it just becomes an ideological arena of hegemony and counter-hegemony. And it's up to people on the ground, on the grassroots level, to use those and use the legal path to try to advance the Palestinian struggle. As groups have done here, taken Canada to court. People in the US did that, people in Europe are doing that. Use the court system to the best of your ability. I don't know that they'll succeed, they probably won't, but they didn't in the US either. But it's a step in the right direction. At least make them worry about this. At least make them spend resources on this. At least don't make it so easy for them to commit a genocide and get away with it. So I don't devalue international law. I just have to, all I do is say we have to be honest with ourselves about what it is, and its limitations, and how we can use it to advance the cause of justice, and understanding where it will work against us as well, because it has and it can also work against us. I think we are in a moment now where, like all institutions, international law is facing the prospects of that major crisis of legitimacy. And I do think that this crisis of legitimacy is something that's going to happen over time. It won't be quick. It won't be a sudden thing that happens. It's going to happen over decades. But it is already started, because it was already happening before, but it's intensified over the last year, and is going to intensify with all kinds of consequences that is very difficult for us to predict at this point. And all nations who claim, like Canada, who claim to stand up for international law and are completely not doing that right now, this is where people stop to take you seriously. Because they go, okay, so you were always about your interests and okay, so you're about the law of the jungle, quote unquote. So I think the message that is being communicated to more and more states and people around the world is, you've never lived in a system of that was anything but the quote unquote law of the jungle. Which is a term I don't like, because I think the jungle has some good laws. But more humane than ours, that's for sure. The might makes right. That's a better way to describe it. The might makes right logic. There's so many more people around the world today that are going, that's the only reality. And when a lot of institutions and states and people start to think that way, there's only one result at the end of that. The battle of mights. You know, I know everybody likes to predict World War III every 2 days now, but we are, without a doubt for me, on the path towards a great war. I don't know when, I don't know, it could be decades from now, I don't know how, but there's nothing to me that indicates that we're not. And I can sort of get into indicators if people are interested, but this is one of them. Is the everybody just comes out with this conclusion? Only might works. So what are people going to do when they go only might works? Why better arm up?
Does might make right? Who thinks that? Like, just honestly, like it's popular, right? In political science in particular, foreign policy circles, might makes right. Maybe, right? Okay. And you can be, it doesn't mean you want it to be
Until we
right.
have a classless society, it will always
Ooh, okay, well.
simple. With a monarchy, capitalism, you know, it's a class. Different classes, different privileges. So unless we eliminate socio-economic classes, might will always become, people will have incentive to go and step on every other lower classes to achieve whatever privilege they have, etc. So there's no point in this question. Karl Marx explained it more than 100 years ago. More than 100 years ago. Why are we discussing again, regurgitating again and again with the different words, some variations here and there, just little tweaks?
And you and all of you are proving my point. Nobody in the world actually believes that. So this is really important. When countries go to war, what do? What's the first thing that they do? Almost always. There's exceptions. Because might makes right is fascism, by the way. Colonialism is fascism. It's the same thing. Look at all the structures. It's fascism. That's what the Germans were doing in Europe. The Japanese were doing. The Brits were doing. Right? The Americans thought they were liberals. We can get into that whole complexity. But what do countries do how do they invade a country? One of the first most important things they do? Defense, you're getting there, yeah, I think. Justifying, yeah, sorry. And
they break down populations and groups so that they can.
well, that dominating control, yeah, and we can get in, but they justify it, right? You always have to have this casus belli, you have to have even the Romans, you go back in ancient times, there always had to be a just war, right, for various reasons, right? So that sense of justice permeates global society and always has. And that desire for international law, that desire to have some stability, for the weak to be protected, for everybody to be protected, and we're seeing this in the global south. The global south, international law is immensely popular, right? Even countries that we demonize, like China wants to have, China's one of the main backers of like a structured international system. It doesn't mean internally we have to agree with China, but one of the main backers in international affairs. And you're seeing a break right now. And something also important to keep in mind, like when Canada was really important, the UN was being founded, it's basically white and European. And these white and European and Latin American countries that, by the way, are structured like America and Canada, especially at the time with the sort of white elites in charge, the colonial elites, they all kind of agreed we don't want to do to each other what we just did in World War II, But World War I, World War II, these were colonial wars in the end. The colonial empires turned on each other. They had no more land to conquer. They went the natural course that they always would, and Karl Marx described that, right? You see now this disruption in international affairs. You have the people who want international law, a lot in Canada. I think a lot of Canadians do believe strongly in it, but especially in the global south. And then you have the rules-based order. And you'll notice now Americans, especially in the Biden administration, never talk about the rules-based order and international law in the same breath, because it's different. The rules-based order they're having in mind is Western hegemony. The United States represents the West and like the last great leader of the Western bloc that dominated the global South. And this is the big fault line taking place. And I agree with you. It doesn't necessarily have to be a violent war, but World War III would be the end of the colonial wars, 1, 2, and 3. Unfortunately, that horrible trilogy, right? But we see that fault line in international affairs in Palestine, like during the foundation of the United Nations, and so many international institutions and Israel are right at the center of that fault line.
Can I, I'm not trying to shift directions, but I want to roll us back towards something. Let's assume we've got these sort of cataclysmic moments. Of course, whether or not there's a great war or we're on the trajectory towards a great war, but nevertheless, in the interim period, we have the levels and scales of destruction to human life and existence in so many places, and are to a large extent an affirmation of the status quo and the hierarchical order of power as we've witnessed it with Canada, the United States, and various other Western countries trying their best to preserve that sort of primacy, if you will, in the global order. But then when these moments become so jarring, right, we end up having this attempt at sort of remedial solutions that are meant to kind of band-aid the situation and demonstrate what appears to be like a humanitarianism and a charitable posturing towards those types of conditions and circumstances. So for example, when it comes to Palestinians, especially in Gaza, the whole discussion around what can be done to save whomever has survived or to, throw them the bones, if you will. I want to zoom in a little bit on UNRWA, because UNRWA has become kind of one of those like lightning torch kind of issues, right? In Canada, it has, or as has been advertised or described about the history of UNRWA and Canada's contributions to UNRWA in the past, today, Canada vis-a-vis UNRWA and Canada vis-a-vis support for Palestinians, support for civilian services for the most part. What is the take-home message from that? Where is Canada vis-a-vis at least that very menial commitment that it once had?
Yeah, so this is what one of the brutal things that colonial systems do to people. They render you in such a precarious position where you're going to need an assistance from them that is ultimately geared towards keeping you down. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's a brutal reality. And that's what UNRWA is. So Israel expels Palestinians in 1940. 750,000 at least. They become refugees. The world goes, well, we gotta do something. They create UNRWA to help take care of the refugees. That's a way of basically appeasing the Arab states that the British and the French and the Americans wanted to keep good relations with. It's also a way to manage people's resistance to the project that expelled them. So if you keep people so destitute that they have nothing to lose whatsoever, nothing at all, they're going to resist with everything they have. If you keep them in a state of barely alive, but alive enough where they're at least going, I have some hope in a kind of future, then you are much more likely to be able to keep them there and not have them resist you. And that's essentially what UNRWA became over time, is that it's the reason why the US, Canada, and all of those countries give money to UNRWA is not out of charity. It's not to help poor, starving Palestinians. It's part of a political calculation and a political project to keep them from resisting you, to keep them going, okay, tame them. And tame people around them that might come to their aid if they do resist you en masse. That's essentially what UNRWA is. Now, of course, UNRWA, then this is what I mean about the brutal position that the colonialism and empire used to colonize it. Then it becomes your source of life. So losing it actually has serious consequences for millions of Palestinians. The Israeli state, of course, was okay with this situation for a while. But like I said, they're not interested in permanent apartheid. Well, I didn't mention that in this talk, but in other places, they're not interested in permanent apartheid. Apartheid is just a passing stage, transition into the next moment and phase of settler colonial conquest. That's how apartheid usually operates. In South Africa, it was cut short. There was probably never going to be a revival of that settler colonial conquest. It probably reached its limits in South Africa, so that apartheid probably became, even though the white South Africans wanted to go and actually get rid of all the Africans, the black Africans and others, or a good chunk of them, and continue more settler colonial conquest, it probably had reached that limit of that project that it was going to always stay apartheid. But apartheid for settler colonies is never the final stage. It's just a holding pattern. You stay in the holding pattern to secure your already existed, or your already accomplished settler colonial conquest, slowly expand it, keep the people down, keep them entirely dependent on you so that they don't resist. And then, without, if you can, not allowing yourself to become dependent on them, which is what happened in South Africa. The Israelis are being very careful in order to not let that happen here. And then you move on to the next step. So right now, Israel views this as the next step, which is why you see this right now, which is their now legal, strong, political and legal push to end UNRWA once and for all. Which would end the Palestinian right of return. It would no longer be part of the conversation, because you're now stripping the Palestinian refugees of their status as refugees. And B, make life impossible for Palestinians who are entirely dependent on UNRWA. Millions, at least 3 million within Palestine, probably 2 or 3 million outside of Palestine that are dependent on UNRWA, if not more. You probably know those numbers better than I do, but it's a good number of Palestinians that are very dependent on UNRWA. So make life so impossible for them that they would leave Palestine, and those outside of Palestine would give up their right of return and move on. Canada's role in this, again, I'm sure the officials and the people running these programs mean well, and there is, like I said, tangible help that you can see, because now we're saying cutting it is going to be devastating. So obviously there are some good it's doing, but politically, it was always part of the project of keeping Palestinians down. And now it's being removed at a stage where it's, the Palestinians are really cornered. This is not we've been standing strong for 100+ years, and I still have faith that we're going to come through this too. But this is a very tough moment for Palestinians on a number of levels, including politically. The Israeli state and the American empire are bearing down with all their might to quote unquote finish the job. So. Canada's role when it comes to UNRWA. I mean, in January, of course, they joined all the other in the fake thing of cutting the funding to it, the fake allegations. That's Canada. So they were told you're part of this, and they said yes, sir. That's it. Yeah.
One of my friends from Al Hadil pointed out to me, Hebron, pointed out to me that there's 1 billion people in the West right now fighting the Palestinians, putting all their might down on the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are still resisting. And you can see that with indigenous nations on Turtle Island, they resist to this day. And that won't change. What's interesting about UNRWA, maybe for you to know, you probably don't know, is the first commissioner of UNRWA, I don't know if that was the title, was a Canadian, Howard Kennedy. And for the first, I think it was 20 years, until 1950 to 69, it was basically Western donors funding UNRWA. Arabs, and they kept trying to get Arab donors to help pay. And Arab states kept saying, why would we pay for the Palestinians to be displaced from their homes rather than for them to realize their right to return home, which every Palestinian thought they would have when they were first ethnically cleansed in the first Nakba. We're into 3 Nakbas now, right? The second one was in 1967, all democratic administrations that oversaw them, just to let you know, for the United States. We have now, UNRWA though has shifted now, where, as you said, it's a lifeline for Palestinians, much like international law, where international law has become inconvenient for the West. UNRWA has become inconvenient. Canada was one of the first countries undermining UNRWA, back to Stephen Harper. Poilievre will almost certainly cut funding. But Canada was sort of like, it has become a bellwether for sort of the right wing in the West and how it's going to react to the Middle East. And we saw that with Stephen Harper cutting funding to UNRWA over the first Gaza war, actually, so interconnected with Gaza again. As a result of the first Gaza war, Canada cut a lot of funding to Palestinian organizations, and that was in 2008, 2009, and it's been so it wasn't surprising for me that Canada came out was with the United States right away after those those misinvestigated, those allegations, those whispers from Israel that UNRWA had some people involved who might be terrorists, a huge organization, tens of thousands of people. So you cut the funding for the civilians who were surviving off it. The widow of John McCain, the man who used to sing "Bomb Bomb Iran," herself is saying that UNRWA is absolutely necessary to feed Palestinians, to keep them alive. This is not a peacenikeness, or maybe she is now. Yeah, maybe she's become. I don't know. But now that UNRWA serves this purpose, Canada's like, oh, I don't know.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and we'll open things up for the audience. And it's a question that is puzzling for a lot of us, but also one that reserves or might have some room for hope and prospects that might leave us feel a little bit encouraged. Because right now, I think I need it more so than anything else. We've witnessed over the last 13, 14 months, what appears to be a shift in public opinion in Western countries, not with Canada not being an exception in that regard, in relation to Israel, perceptions of Israel, and also perceptions of Palestinians and solidarity with Palestinians. Some of that exists and has really been quite muscular within the indigenous Palestinian communities, but also Black indigenous Palestinian, but I mean, so many different configurations of solidarity with Palestinian self-determination and liberation and pushing back against all of these things that we've described. To what extent do you think public opinion on Canada's settler colonial history and, by extension, the Israeli Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine matters, politically speaking? Does it hold any promise moving forward? And by extension, do you think that activism itself, right, is activism simply just that? It's resigned to the spaces within which it can be influential or impactful as a form of disruption, or can it be more impactful in a way that could be transformative? I know that the realities on the ground in Palestine remain vexing, but in terms of at least Canada's role and its continued contribution to this horrific situation, is there room and is there possibility for both protest and shifting public opinion in that regard?
Yeah, so it's clear the public opinion has shifted. It's clear, especially among the younger generations, that it has shifted, and that shift seems to me like it's going to last. The shift, as I was saying earlier in my talk today, it started in 2021, as far as I'm concerned, with Sheikh Jarrah and the attack on Gaza that came after, and in that moment, social media played a critical role in that. But I shouldn't say that. I should say the Palestinian activists and journalists and scholars on social media use social media to make a critical intervention in public discourse and show the shallowness and superficiality of mainstream discourse on this issue. It was very easy for young people, especially, to look at the headline from the CBC and then look at the real picture on the ground and the real video from the ground and go, well, those two don't match. So something's off here. And then they're seeing that every day, multiple times a day. And they're like, okay, something really fishy is happening here. That started in 2021, and now it's just escalated into a whole other level. Where especially again, young people and students, as we see it in the student encampments, are not at all buying into the propaganda. Whether it's the Canadian government's propaganda or the Israeli state's propaganda or the mainstream media's propaganda, they're just not buying into it. So that can only be helpful for us. We are a people power movement. That's it. We got nothing to offer you in terms of a state. We got no military, we got no economic capital, we got no political pull. What we do have is truth and justice, which is what speaks to people. That's it. We don't have to lie. I can just come here and talk. It's a pretty nice feeling. I don't have to have training by a Zionist organization as to how to answer every question you ask me, because I gotta lie. You can't tell the truth, so you need to be trained on how to handle the questions and shift it back to the Israeli state propaganda and all the rest of it. I don't have to do any of that. Most people don't who speak for Palestine either. You just have to look, use your eyes, and just speak from the place of justice, and that's it, and truth. So that's very appealing to people across the world. More people see their experience in it in different ways. So like you said, some of the indigenous activists that I've talked to have said things like, I've read in books about what my community went to. I feel like I'm now seeing what it actually looked like. Black activists saying, relating their entire sort of story of struggle to this the struggle against the ugliest, most extreme form of racism and colonialism and imperialism. And communities everywhere, working class white people, just saying, I knew our institutions were shit, but man, I didn't know they were this. So you see it across Jewish communities. And you also are seeing it increasingly across the political spectrum. Some on the right wing, in the young generation, are also not buying into the Israeli propaganda. Now they have very problematic ways of looking at it, and their solutions are all very problematic, but they're also just not buying into the propaganda. So, take hope in the success of the students at the University of Windsor. That was a huge accomplishment. Still the only university that I know that has adopted BDS officially. They didn't say that, but they cut ties with BDS. You don't have to say I'm following the BDS campaign. I don't care about that.
I don't need a three-letter acronym.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Just say I'm not working with Israeli universities. I love you. Great job. Finally. And they tried to rescind that, the lobby, and it didn't work. They're going to come back again, so it's going to be an ongoing story. And Windsor basically said, well, we have none right now anyway, but we won't. That's something, right? Like, is UBC or SFU going to do it? No, but keep putting the pressure on. I don't know what else to do other than to keep putting pressure on and working from the ground up. I keep saying this, the only thing that can be accomplished from a space like this is BDS, that's it. And that's a big one. So push your institutions, push your governments, you're gonna fail, you're gonna get attacked, work with others, protect yourselves, do all those things smartly and strategically. But keep pushing until one day it'll work. I do see a lot of this younger generation that is, the propaganda won't work on them 20 years down the line. The Israeli state, the American government, the Canadian state, the American state, all of these who are part and parcel of this genocide, they actually believe that 2-3 years from now, or whenever this is over, that you'll all forget and move on. They do. They think it's a rebranding job that they'll be able to do. They'll buy you off, for those of you who are loud. If you're an influencer, they'll go. They've already been doing that. They'll offer you money to go and say their lines. And if you're not, they'll threaten you with punishment. And then they think that will eventually work and you'll all move on. I think that's fantasy. Maybe I'm naive in believing in people, but I think it's fantasy that will work. People don't just forget genocide. They don't just move on. They won't. Certainly not in the Arab world. Not. I don't even think here. So
especially if they're ongoing genocides, and this is one that
it's not going to end anytime soon. Yeah. So.
I think they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. They do if the economic situation, if they will become really in very bad economic situation, they do.
They forget.
They will forget.
If you're saying that speaking up will put you in an economic situation, or some other forces are put you in such a bad economic situation, but see, to me, that actually is that is the opposite. If that happens, then they'll be like, well, we're just as oppressed now as the Palestinians, which would be a ridiculous thing to say, but still, it would keep it. It would actually activate it even more. No, I think in that situation it'll activate it even more. The situation where it might work is if there's actually economic incentives to go around and you can buy people off. That's when it usually works. Not when people are starving. When they're starving, they're going to line up with the Palestinians. That's how we usually attract.
It's gotten too expensive to buy people off too. It's getting too expensive.
Yeah.
So I just want to open things up, but I would just in the interest of both time, but also the fact that we very often or very, very seldom hear from Palestinians and Indigenous persons and also students. I would like to encourage folks who are from those communities / category, I hate to categorize, I'm so sorry. But just if you're a student, if you're Indigenous, if you're Palestinian, and you want to ask a question, we want to give you the right to pose that question first before we open things up. So I think we have microphones. Do we have microphones?